I haven't noticed as much in the news since the election is over. Now, I could be wrong on that, you know, it's just a short 2-week experience there. But what we'd like to do, wrap up some thoughts from last week that we were talking. Roland asked a lot of questions, right? Didn't answer any of them, but you asked a lot of questions, and I think we're supposed to answer them. You know, the source of law, etc. Let me go ahead and pray for our time. And Eric, I think we will do some Q&A at some point, or we will want to be available for that. And so we might need a handheld mic as well. So thank you for coming. Let's go ahead and pray. Father, thank you for this new day. It has been good for those who've been to church already to lift our voices as one in thanks to you for your blessings, but most importantly, the blessings of Jesus Christ and this new life that we share. We thank you for this nation. We thank you for its rich heritage and history. We acknowledge its many faults and flaws. And we, your people, seek to be part of the people of this nation to bring about justice and righteousness on earth as it is in heaven. And so use these minutes together as we talk and think and share with one another to strengthen your kingdom, strengthen our lives, and help us to be more faithful followers of Jesus where we live here. And so we ask this for his sake and in his name. Amen. I'm going to turn it to you.
Already?
Already.
I guess I owe Dennis Stucia an apology, since this is probably repetition of what he heard from Arthur Holmes in college. I didn't take any courses from Arthur Holmes. I was too dumb. But I ended up buying all of his books and catching up as I went along. I think the first question I raised, our first Sunday of doing this, was how we look at the divisions in America, and more specifically, how we look at the history of the United States versus the history of the French Revolution. So I thought I would talk a little bit about that fairly early on today. One of the things that I discovered that really set me on this path was a book by Richard John Neuhaus, The Naked Public Square. He wrote it when he was a Lutheran pastor, subsequently became a Roman Catholic priest, and was the founder and editor, until he passed away, of First Things. And I guess I am still reading First Things since the first issue came out. But I was at the launching of The Naked Public Square. And that had just kind of advanced a lot of my thinking about the role of religion in American society. Which takes us back then to the French Revolution and what I would put the Reformation. The question that I've had is, how do I integrate my Christian faith and thinking into my discipline, whatever that is? And for the last 55 years, it's been law. And so that really has been much of the focus. My interest has been in jurisprudence. But I've always felt that I had a role in the church, that part of my Christian life was being active in the life of a church. And the question came up, was doing so part of Christian nationalism? Now, that question never arose until Trump came along. And so I remember when Trump was running for president, Robert Jeffries, pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, was one of the, quote, evangelicals surrounding him, as was Franklin Graham and a number of others. And I called Franklin and said, you know, I think you really need to be careful about how close you get to Trump. I said, I think it will affect the quality and the acceptance of your ministry. And clearly, Franklin was more involved with Samaritan's Purse than he was with the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. But it bothered me that he had aligned himself, appeared to have aligned himself as closely with Donald Trump. And Franklin told me, no, that was not the case, that he was going from city to city having prayer groups. And I said, but your picture was with Trump, both as a campaign and in the White House. I flew down to Dallas to meet with Robert Jeffries. And Robert Jeffries was also a very strong Trump supporter. And I was again concerned with the effect his ministry would have, as well as the ministry of First Baptist Church of Dallas, which originally was one of the big mega churches before they started having it, on spreading the gospel. My point to Robert Jeffries is what you're doing with Trump will align you with Trump. It will align your church with Trump, because I remember going to a church service in which he'd just come back from the White House and talked about his time with Trump. And I just didn't think that was proper in a sermon. And I said, not only that, I was on the board of Dallas Theological Seminary at the time, and I said, Robert, you're a graduate of Dallas Seminary. What you're doing affects the reputation of the seminary as well as your church. And at that point, Christian nationalism didn't have the name
Correct.
it later got. But my concern was, how do I, as a Christian, function at a national level? At a pretty senior position, and be able to express my faith and express it openly among my colleagues. Is there a difference between how I think about the law and how my colleagues think about the law? None of us stole paper or pencils or anything from the supply room for our kids at home. None of us harassed our secretaries. So, you know, is there a fundamental difference in how I think about the source, the nature, and role of law in society, which is pretty much where I think I started the first time that we started out. Last week, we closed talking about national law. And I won't repeat the history of national law, but there are certain points in natural law which appeal to me from the time I studied it in an honors jurisprudence class in law school, and has appealed to me ever since. And it really wasn't until I gave a talk in Johannesburg, South Africa, on philosophy of law within the Reformed tradition that it really struck me. With within the natural law tradition, there are three basic principles. One, the universality and immutability of natural law, or law which is given by the sovereign. Two, and the sovereign, we're talking about God. Two, the standing of natural law is higher to any man-made law. And as a result, any man-made law that does not conform to natural law fails, is invalid. And three, the discovery of natural law or higher law by reason or divine revelation. So that was kind of where I was until the confirmation hearings of Clarence Thomas. Charles James and Kay Coles James were friends of Clarence Thomas, and they had invited me to meet with Clarence several times, with Clarence and Jenny, to pray for them when they were going through the second sphere. But what was interesting was that Senator Biden, then Senator Biden, was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And he asked Clarence Thomas about his view of natural law. And I thought Clarence Thomas spelled it out very adequately. And as I mentioned earlier, natural law comes within the tradition, within the Catholic tradition, more so than in the Protestant tradition. That's where all the academic writing has been. And so Biden said, well, I'm a Roman Catholic, and that's where the theory has been developed, largely from Aquinas. And he says natural law just helps us interpret the positive law. In other words, he puts the positive law above natural law. And I couldn't accept Senator Biden's explanation for that. Then we come to the Enlightenment and the post-Enlightenment period. And this is where we get into positive law. But what came out of the Enlightenment, and this leads me to the French Revolution, is the first element of the Enlightenment was radical doubt. Anything that could not be established positively was viewed as unnecessary and ruled out. Second, only that which was certain could be accepted within a philosophical system. Third was rational reconstruction. Complex whole issues were broken down into pieces, analyzed, and then reassembled. And fourth, there was a recapitulation of the argument based on the reassembled pieces. Well, if you think through it, John Locke in the 17th century, but more particularly Immanuel Kant, came to the idea that natural law lawyers, jurists, philosophers could not get to the place that they got through that process. And that's when we started with natural law being not based on authority or divine commands, such as Aquinas did it, but based on reason and reason alone. And as you can imagine, as every philosopher tried to think through natural law, they all had their different reasons. And so there was a great deal of confusion over what the source of law was, what its nature was, what its role in society was as a result of differing theories. And the Dutch jurist Hugo de Grotius in the 17th century really expanded that and is viewed as the father of modern law. So we have what's called the post-Enlightenment challenge. And that is that there must be standards that are accepted for determining what is reasonable. And the problem that we have with that is it specifies what those standards and evidence are. And basically, it's all empirical evidence based on our senses. But there was a hook, and the hook was if you didn't buy that, then holding on to your faith or your belief system was being irresponsible. And so, if you could not establish God by empirical evidence through your senses, or if you could not establish moral precepts by your senses and empirical evidence, you were being irresponsible to hold on to that belief system. So that takes us now back to the difference in America and whether we view America as a Christian nation. I don't go that far, but I do hold that America came out of the Reformation. The basic principles that were involved in the founding of America came out of the Reformation. Ironically, the French Revolution took place about the same time. And so you had the idea of the Exodus, the people of Israel leaving Egypt, being involved in people leaving Europe and coming to America. You had the idea that God's providence was in somehow ordaining this process. And that didn't make the United States a Christian nation, as we've often heard in the arguments over Christian nationalism. It just says that there was a biblical consensus that came out of the Reformation based largely on the sovereignty of God, that led to the start of the country. Sir William Blackstone, a British jurist, wrote rather extensively on the laws of England. And he was quite clear in indicating the sovereignty over British laws and the common law system which Britain had adopted at that time. So William Blackstone's commentaries were read in the United States by judges as they decided cases, because we did not have the common law system which we had adopted from the British. The French Revolution starts with humans, with man. And all of the rights coming out of the French Revolution, including if you look at the French Revolution motto, are centered in humans. God is erased from any consideration of nation, state, religion relationships. And for a large measure, that has stayed with the French people even to this day. Now, going back to my original question, the big divide in America today is the divide between how you look at America's founding and the role of a sovereign God, and how you look at America's founding from the perspective of the French Revolution. And most of what we see today, and most of what we live in our society and culture, and most of what we even live in our churches, come out of the French Revolution and put man first. So that is just kind of a quick summary. Now, there were three people that had a great deal of influence on much of my thinking. One was Jacques Ellul, a French philosopher at the University of Bordeaux. And he is an interesting guy, but he dealt with the problem of how modernity, and specifically how technology, affects our views of the role of religion in society. But more particularly, there was a Scottish theologian, James Orr, and Abraham Kuyper, who I mentioned last week, that looked on the role of the nation state and the church. And they developed what was called sphere sovereignty, where the family was responsible for the family. The community or the city was responsible for the affairs of the community. The nation was responsible for the civil affairs of the nation. The church was responsible for what happened in the church. And there is a real question. I was in the States when prayer was outlawed from schools. I never was really excited about state-sponsored prayer in schools, although our school had Youth for Christ clubs in the school. And that was part of my life. Every Friday there was a Youth for Christ club, which included some singing, some prayer, and some Bible study. But that was all arranged by Christians and by Youth for Christ. It wasn't organized by the state. So you've got James Orr and Abraham Kuyper coming up with sphere sovereignty, and then in the 50s, 60s, I guess, another Dutchman, I've got to mention the Dutch, Herman Dooyeweerd expanded on Jacques Ellul's, on Abraham Kuyper's writings about the religion and state. So this is basically where I have been. I have never decided a case as a judge that I thought went against my biblical principles and standings. If I felt I was forced to do that, I usually recused myself and passed it to another judge. We as judges have no choice. Cases come to us, and you have to decide what you have in front of you. And yet, I felt I was always able to maintain my Christian faith without subscribing to something that I thought went against biblical teaching. Okay.
Thank you. The discussion of the source of law as from a sovereign or natural law, a higher source, versus something that comes strictly from the people, probably is what's in play. My guess is that most folks today in America, they say, where do laws come from, or where does law come from? They would probably say something like the Congress, the Senate, the State House, right? The General Assembly and state senators. If they pass laws, then that's the law. There is no source beyond those who are elected. They're legislators, right? I mean, that's by definition. And functionally, that is true, right? In the sense of the laws of the Commonwealth of Virginia are those that have been legislated and then amended and overturned and passed, etc. And so is that what stands behind the fight for the political, the political fight is because there is no source beyond the human. And so we're functionally atheists at some level, right? We're effectively, there is no God, so ironically, we're not a Christian nation, we're effectively an atheist nation in the sense that we fight to get congressmen and senators elected. I mean, it wasn't election day, it was election week, and what was the thing? Who's going to get control of the Senate? Well, that doesn't sound much from a Christian standpoint like God is sovereign, right? And so I've been curious just of watching this thing play out and how we Christians get sucked into a mindset that actually is not biblical, is not faithful. If God raises up a president that you didn't vote for and you think is bad for America, does that mean God had nothing to do with that? I'm seeing George Kinsey, we've studied Daniel, God raises up and deposes kings. And so how do we live part of the tension is how we live in a society as people of faith with an understanding that God is sovereign and providential and raises up people. And yet when our team doesn't win or our person doesn't win, do we fall apart? And so, I'm curious. That's something for further reflection. Idolatry, I think, is at the heart of what the world is. The world is not crying out idolatry. They're saying Christian nationalism, because Christians are fighting to get their people elected, be it Franklin Graham and Robert Jeffress, supporting, President Trump. And so I wonder if we need to rethink how we understand the sovereignty of God. And so we've encouraged you, prior to the election, vote your conscience, vote as you wish. I really don't care how you vote and anybody else at Greenwich votes. I don't care how you vote. Hopefully you don't care how I vote. But what I find interesting is the strength with which the Christian community, or some in the Christian community, attach to the ballot box and to the electoral process, as if everything depends on it. And so, if the preservation of the United States is the highest goal, have we not drifted into idolatry? Because that which we would assign as ultimate value, if the preservation of a certain way of life is the highest goal, then we're bordering on idolatry. We Presbyterians have a book of confessions. One of those confessions has a set of questions. The Shorter Catechism, the Westminster Shorter Catechism says, what is the chief end of man? Does anybody know the answer? What is it? Man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Centuries of Presbyterians, that was Sunday school. We knew that. We've even lost that, right? God is the chief end. Knowing God, glorifying God, enjoying God, living in God's purposes. That means, I believe, everything else are means to that end. And so I think idolatry happens when we begin to shift the means and the ends. When God becomes a means to the end of preserving the United States of America. When God and the Bible become a means to the end of preserving America the way I want it to be. And so I think where we start to flirt with the dangerous side of Christian nationalism that may pervert things in our country and certainly pervert the faith is when we enlist God for our ends of electing the proper kind of legislators who will vote the way I want. And I'm making control of the House, control of the Senate, control of the White House effectively of ultimate importance. Our scriptures tell of a time when Babylon came and took Israel captive, and that was in the sovereign purposes of God. We have to entertain the notion that it may be in the sovereign purposes of God for this nation to be transformed in such a way that Christians fall into some measure of persecution or some measure of outsider status. That doesn't mean God is not sovereign, right? God was still sovereign when Israel was in Babylon. And so I think there's great confusion around means and ends. One of the members of the class sent me something. It's a website, but there was, this says, Attention Patriots. The We the People Bible, so that's the name of the Bible. It's We the People Bible, is available for the first time in history. Our Bible is for those who believe it is time to give America back to God and features copies of America's founding documents. So I went to the website of the We the People Bible, and you can buy for $89.99 the Patriot Bundle, which has a Bible, a challenge coin, a bookmark, and an American flag lapel. And I thought about getting that up top, but the cover of the Bible has the American flag kind of draping down, and it says We the People. So the cover of the Bible says We the People on it. And inside the cover of the Bible, instead of the maps and the indexes that we would normally find, has the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bible. This is what I think is Christian nationalism. Okay? Where you're conflating the founding documents and you're putting them inside the covers of the sacred text that we affirm. And as we look at those sacred scriptures as holy and authoritative and inerrant and infallible, it's conceivable that others would look then at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, etc., as inerrant and infallible. This is where faith and citizenship and patriotism start to conflate in such a way that we are really talking Christian nationalism, I think. So let me urge you not to buy the We the People Bible, unless it is for purposes, as I may buy one, for a teaching tool, right, as an example. And so I think there's something about idolatry that sits underneath this. And so the difference of the French and American revolutions, I think, is significant, because I think they killed all the priests too, right? Was it first kill the lawyers and then you follow with the priests, right? Let's get rid of anyone who...
No, that was Shakespeare.
Yeah, exactly right.
Killed the lawyers.
And so this idea that those who would appeal to a higher source of authority, we must remove them from influence in our society. There is no authority outside the human. I mean, I think this is what you're saying, right? And so when you get rid of natural law and the like, the source of law is only in the human family. Hence the fight for legislatures. And so I think we're effectively an atheist nation, and we Christians are complicit with that. When we make the fight at the ballot box, we frame it as if this is the most important thing.
Which is rather interesting, because the thing that you hear often is We the People, which is declared in both the Declaration and in the Constitution. And if the source of law is We the People, then we're making ourselves as a society idols. Mm-hmm. And a lot of us in church go along with that. We the people determine what the laws are. And we elect people that conform to the idea that the law springs up from the people rather than from a sovereign God. Now, it's clear, and one of the things is kind of interesting about some of what I've read over the years, but certainly out of the Stone Lectures, it comes largely from the idea that, both James Orr and Abraham Kuyper thought that the sovereignty of God was the only and ultimate determination of how society is ultimately to be understood and governed. But one of the things that I found interesting as I reread some of these books was they often start at the Decalogue. And when I have taught morality in society, I usually start at the creation mandates and see how they are expanded in the Decalogue, how they are further explained in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and so on, and how they are further explained by the prophets, and then further developed in the New Testament. And so, you know, what we have with respect to our freedom is the idea that we get our freedom from what we assert as ourselves. And God has no role in it.
But wouldn't this then, and I'm attentive to the time here, wouldn't this be reflective of the original sin that happened in the garden, the human family, Adam and Eve, rejecting God and choosing to be the source of good and evil, be the ones who determine right and wrong, good and evil? You know, don't eat of that tree of knowledge of good and evil, for you will die. God did not intend for us to be the ones to determine good and evil, right and wrong. He created us with consciences and a moral awareness and moral agency, but that we would follow the dictates that he would set out for us. And so, in some sense, isn't it really just back to the beginning of the garden? Are we the source of right and wrong, of law, or is there some other source? And
that's an interesting question, because for 40 years, I questioned national law on that very point. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then it hit me that God created us in his own image. And although the fall had an effect on our ability to reason, it didn't completely destroy our ability to reason. And so there is some force still remaining in the creation mandates that is explicated further on in the Bible. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer had no problem with it when he went to the hanging, nor did Martin Luther King, who published his letters from a Birmingham jail, have any problem with these principles I'm talking about. And yet, they were not accused of being Christian nationalism. Mm-hmm. You were going to have some questions.
We have no time for questions. We're out of time. We're gonna thank you for coming. For some of you have been here maybe all 5 weeks. Some of you have come maybe just today. Obviously, it's deep, it's complex. There are popular expressions of this that we're interacting with. There are deep-rooted philosophical, intellectual, academic expressions of this. It's not going away. The issues will not go away. I think this issue, this topic, this reality will be adjudicated in our society at least every 2 years in a significant way from an electoral standpoint. But I think in some ways they're wrestled with every day. How will we live our lives? Will we live as if God is sovereign? Will we live as if there is revealed word? Will we live faithfully as citizens of our society? And so hopefully at Greenwich we'll be those who, as we point, I think the first week we met, we talked about we live in two commonwealths, as it were. You know, we've got this represented in the American flag. Every Christian lives somewhere, and so has some geopolitical national thing around them. And every Christian lives as a citizen of the kingdom of God. May we live faithfully in both. Judge, thank you for your wisdom, your experience, and let us know if you're going to have to build another addition onto your house because I know you told me you bought a bunch of books even since we started this. So, Diana, sorry about this. Father, we thank you for your gifts and graces, which are so many, more than we could count. of those gifts and graces. One is to be here in this land. And so help us to live honorably, to live well, to live faithfully as citizens of the United States and of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Help us to be good neighbors, but help us to live towards that higher kingdom. And so, Lord, as the days unfold, may we continue to love you with our heart, our soul, our mind, and our strength. Thank you for Roland. Thank you for his teaching. Thank you for his experiences, which are so rich and varied. Lord, may we continue to grow together at Greenwich now and forever. As all God's people said, amen. We're going to go to church, or some of you are going to go to brunch, okay?